Okay, welcome along, everyone. Welcome along to this webinar on lean portfolio management. My pleasure to introduce Craig Smith to you. He is our product lead in business agility and managing the basically business agility side of things in this suite of courses and so forth. He is primarily a coach and a trainer for us, so coaching people and helping them get started and get underway and get things working properly, as well as delivering a number of our training courses. What he's going to talk about today is, as you can see from the slide, lean portfolio management. There's an old Japanese quote that goes, "Vision without action is a daydream. Action without vision is a nightmare." Lean portfolio management is trying to tie the two of those together. The vision, what we're trying to achieve from the perspective of the organization, the strategy and everything like that, and tying that through to the actions that we need to carry out in terms of the portfolio of products, what we want to do, how do we go about planning that and ensuring that we are delivering something that is actually useful. So tying both the vision and the action together. So you're not here to listen to me. So without any further ado, I think I'll hand it over to Craig.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you, everybody, for taking some time out today to come and talk about lean portfolio management. Yeah, what is it? And as you can see by the title, I believe this is our real key to enterprise agility, and we'll take a little bit on that journey today. But if you kind of want the TLDR, the quick lowdown, it's really about how we apply agility at the portfolio level, similar to what we do down to the team level, just amped up across the portfolio. So if that's all you wanted to know and that's answered your question, and you want to leave now and get 55 minutes back in your day, thanks for coming. If you want to stick around though and learn a little bit more what that means in depth, let's dig in and see what it's all about. And so I think the way to sum it up is it is really about business agility. This is a quote of what business agility is from the Business Agility Institute. As it says there, it's a set of organizational capabilities, behaviors, and ways of working that essentially allows you to achieve your purpose, no matter what the future brings. I really like that little end note to that quote, no matter what the future brings. We don't know what the next thing is. We've been through, last few years of, all sorts of things that we didn't expect that the future would bring, and don't need to repeat those. Obviously, we all know what they are. But the big question is, what's next? And we're starting to see things like AI, for example, really start to get hot. Is that the next big thing? Right, or has it already been the thing? I saw some stats already that says that we've actually passed the top of the precipice of interest in AI. That our interest in AI is starting to wane. Because we've all played around with ChatGPT a little bit. I'm not sure how much I agree with that statement, but it's like we're on to the next thing past that. Our need to move and keep up is just getting worse and worse and worse. The other thing about business agility is that whilst it'll come up a little bit in this talk, I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of the term business agility. I actually much prefer organizational agility, because if we've got any friends from government here, for example, business agility doesn't always map into that. And what if you're a non-profit or things like that, whereas we can all relate to the term organization, but nobody asked me when they came up with the term, so we're stuck with it. That's the term that we often use. But I mentioned changes and complexity. I'm sure many of you have heard of VUCA, and I won't go into too much to explain this. If you haven't heard it before, coined by the US military 20 odd years ago, really just to explain that we are in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And again, don't need to tell you that. But the thing is, we do have those market disruptors. I mentioned things like AI before. We are going through financial volatility. Every day something else in the news tells us that. All of the natural and climate challenges and just the major events that are happening around the world. Again, lots of things that we see on our news every night. And so all those things have an impact on our business. And so the whole point about business agility is so that we can thrive in that, not using the things that we've used before. And so the Business Agility Institute have this model called the domains of business agility. And again, this talk isn't about business agility, nor these domains. If you haven't seen these before, I really do suggest taking a look at the Business Agility Institute website for some more detail. By the way, I will actually just say at this point, don't bother trying to screenshot and things like that. We will send these slides to everyone who attended after the event. So just in case you do want any of this content, we'll make that available to you. But if you look at these domains, what's interesting around the outside is all of these things ultimately are things that we actually need when we think about working at a portfolio. We're going to hear about customer centricity a little bit as we move through this. How do we integrate diverse ideas and champion the customer and sense and respond proactively? I mean, that's VUCA. It's about our culture. Things in that domain talk about acting as one. Being a learning organization. Again, lean portfolio management helps us with that. Value-based delivery, super important. I mean, that's agile down to team level in a nutshell. Delivering value sooner. Being creative, looking for opportunities. And I love the last one down here, a little hard to read, but it says prioritize, prioritize, prioritize. So it's that important. We talk about 3 times. Lean portfolio management is about making sure we're working on the right things. How we operate, our flexible operations, how we fund work, how we balance governance and risk, how we do strategic things, and then of course our leadership, how we empower people and realize their potential. So what you're going to see over the next little while is that whilst we're talking about lean portfolio management, it connects in very nicely to this idea of business agility and brings those together. So this is a diagram I love. I've used this for a few years now. It's actually based on some work by Sally Alada out of the US, but it's the journey to agility. And if you think about the journey that we're on, it is a series of cogs. And if you look down the right-hand side, this idea of true enterprise business agility is where many of us like to go to. Other models might call that a teal model or something like that. But if you stand back and look at most of our organizations, and certainly most of the organizations that I've been involved with in the recent past, we are about somewhere into that second stage. We've knocked over team agility. That's been around for 25 plus years, whether it be Scrum, extreme programming, scaled agile, but down to the team level, we're pretty good at that. We know how to do that. And while some of you may still be early on in your journey, as a community, we've got that. It's just become the de facto way of working in some way, shape, or form. And over the last easily 5+ years, we have really started to push into scaling. So how we then take that and learn it at a teams of teams side, how we scale across teams, how we bring it across divisions or organizations. It's starting to think about things like DevOps that bring those two sides together, the whole leadership and culture part. This is where most organizations are playing quite successfully now and starting to roll that through. So where's the next stage? And that's really where we are now is organizational agility. Is now we have to take those things and now apply it across our portfolio, setting up proper value streams, and being more mature in our products. And I suspect for some of you, you are now starting to move into that space, maybe successfully, maybe challenged, but that's now where the community is really starting to put its focus, which is why we're talking about this today. Where does it go further than this? Well, things like how do we really start to disrupt areas like talent and HR, how we think about our transformations, not just agile transformations, but organizational transformations. And then how we bring other places around really thinking about how we deal with finance and legal and sales and marketing in order to get true business agility is that next frontier. It's not necessarily linear. I suspect for many of you, we've been chipping away at those things over time, but that's when we start to see true agility there, which allows us then to ultimately be a true business agility enterprise where we actually are not just reacting, but being ahead of customer needs, looking for those disruptions, for learning cultures, all of those. And the interesting thing I think about the end of this is it took us a long while to get through the green and the blue parts. Once you start to unlock the yellow, the orange and the purple actually start to become a lot faster. So don't panic. It's not as if we've potentially got another 15, 20 years to push through this. If we do start to unlock these things and really truly see them, I think these will unlock a lot faster. And that's why something like lean portfolio management truly is that key, because it's now bringing all together all the stuff that we've been playing around for a long time and start to then help us get towards that true business agility that I know many on this call are looking for. So that's all well and good, but I suspect some of you are sitting there going, that's great, Craig, but what is lean portfolio management? So here's our quote in a nutshell. Now this comes from IC Agile, who I think have probably the best generic quote out there. There's lots of places talking about this, but I think the genericism of this quote is why I like it. And as you can see there, it provides a mechanism for organizations to fund and manage the flow of initiatives and activities across the whole enterprise. So how do we make sure that we're working on the right things and we're spending money on the right things? It allows us to maximize the value delivered to customers and their stakeholders as well. So those things go hand in hand. And so what it really is then an alignment of our strategy and making sure we're working on the most important things whilst we're thinking about the customer. And that's the key. Are we working on the right things, but actually hitting that customer need as we move through? And so the Business Agility Institute and IC Agile sat down a year or so ago, and they said, well, how do we distill this into a set of principles? We're Agile, right? We love principles. So what are those principles that help us understand lean portfolio management? And there are 9 of those. So we're going to take a look through each of these one by one in more detail. But these are the principles that underlie what lean portfolio management is. And like any good set of principles, whilst we might be playing around in some of them, it's not until you realize all of these that you probably truly have met LPM. So let's go through the principles one by one very quickly. So the first principle is a shift to customer centricity within a larger context. So as I alluded to before, we've been on this journey a long while, right? Agile Manifesto has customer in the first principle. So it's of no surprise that customer centricity is important. It's just, is it seen or is it remembered when we are up at the portfolio level? Because sometimes we get so hung up on the work we need to do or the amount of work we need to do or how we're going to fund it, we can lose sight at the portfolio level of who really matters, which is ultimately the person who is buying or using the product that we're trying to get out there. And so as you can see and I'm not going to sort of go through these definitions in great detail. You can read these in the slides later, but I will point out a couple of things in here. But I like the bit down the bottom here, which is that everyone in the organization needs a clear line of sight to the customer, the vision, and the larger context. So part of portfolio management is making sure that when we put something into our portfolio, that we ask the question, is this part of our organizational strategy? Is this really sorting a customer issue as opposed to just somebody's will and wish or what we often call the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion, to what we should be working on? Are we working on the right things? And so on the left-hand side, you can see we've got the Agile triangle. If you haven't come across this concept before, traditionally in project management, we often talked about our 3 constraints: scope, cost, and schedule. And you see that down the right-hand side here. And they're important. And the idea of the triangle is that on a triangle, you typically can lock in one point, and then depending on how much you remember from year 8 mathematics, right? Depending on the lines, the other 2 can be variable. And that's the same thing with any of these, is that you can never lock in scope, cost, and schedule. The idea is if you lock one in, the other 2 are going to have some variability. And that's still true, but it's not the only thing. When we start talking about agility particularly, is we want to add in 2 other things, and that is the value and the quality. Now, quality was always talked about in the traditional project management iron triangle. It just was never important enough to be a point on the triangle in its own right. And of course it is important, so it's there. But the interesting thing about this Agile triangle is value, because value in an Agile world is actually fixed. Right? We always work on the highest value item, whether that be down in your product backlog. We prioritize by value. Right? We always want to work on the highest thing. It's the same in the portfolio. So the interesting thing about this is that if we're fixing value in, the only other things we can start to move is we can start to decide how much or how little quality we might do, and then start to move around our constraints. And then, of course, our constraints, we can lock one of those in. So the key thing in lean portfolio management is making sure that we understand what value is and then understand what trade-offs we're going to make. And that helps us then figure out if we are working on the right thing. The second principle is communicating an adaptive strategy with transparency. I'll play a game if anybody understands or knows the source for the diagram on the right-hand side. I suspect somebody has read the book. I'll give you the answer in just a moment. But type it into the chat if you're aware of that particular source. But the idea here is that we absolutely need a strategy that supports our vision. And I would hope, and most organizations that I've worked with over the years typically have a strategy. Whether everybody's aware of it or not, though, is the real question. But do we have a strategy that supports our vision? And if we do, are we making sure that then our portfolio of work is mapping to that strategy? And that strategy needs to be transparent, easy to read, easy to understand, and communicated well, but also then being able to make the right decisions against that. So communicating that strategy, being transparent, and then making sure that we actually use it. And if you, I didn't see any answers in the chat. If you're not aware of that, there's a great book called Playing to Win, which this comes from. And Playing to Win essentially sets out 4 questions that you need to be able to ask about your strategy. And you should theoretically in your organization be able to answer these questions right now if your strategy is being well communicated, right? You should know what our winning aspiration is. In other words, how are we going to succeed? We need to understand the place that we play, in our by the way we sell. Like, are we trying to sell to a wider audience? Are we trying to sell to a niche? Who is our customer basically? Then how we're going to win at doing that. So what is our strategy then to win at that market? And then what capabilities and systems do we need in place in order to do that? So the last 2 are a little more operational, but those top 3 helps you make the right decision. And so part of lean portfolio management is helping people understand that and continually asking those questions to make sure we're playing in the right space. Principle number 3 is making sure that we align around the common goals and how they might change. So, this can be things like, KPIs or OKRs, understand those goals. However you do that I guess is up to you, but making sure again that they're understood, but more importantly that not only are they clear and communicated, but they're measurable. So do we know how we're going to measure ourselves? Can we map the work that we're doing back to those and understand that we're actually making a change? And so this is really also as much as anything about feedback loops. And this little diagram on the left-hand side, if you think about this being what your executive are thinking about, whereas down the bottom is what your teams are doing day to day. So think about, deliver being, say 2-week sprints, for example. The reality is that anything that happens at the top, or in fact in any of the areas below, we want to have communication and decisions that flow down this funnel through everything. So at a team level, I can actually clearly understand why a decision's been made and how that impacts the work I'm doing. But that's only part of the story. The other side is this side of the funnel, which says, how do we then take the reality, what's actually happening, and pass that back up the chain to make sure that we're making the right decisions at whatever area they occur at. So ultimately, if we're seeing reality down here at a team level, how can we make sure that ultimately makes its way back up to the executive or the board so that they can make the right decisions? Now, of course, I'm not talking about all the little 1s and 0 type decisions that happen every day. That would be some sort of synthesis of what's happening across your teams. And that's exactly where a lean portfolio management fits in, because it sits here somewhere in the middle, because it is seeing those things, taking those pieces of information, then being able to distill them back up, whilst also being able to map the things that are important to particular teams or particular parts of the portfolio and map them down. So is there an understanding? And so a lean portfolio management function helps us make sure that we're actually passing that up and down the organization. Principle number 4, define, prioritize, and deliver business value frequently. I'm going to save you a bunch of time and make this really simple. This is just team-based agile in a nutshell. So you already know how to do this. We know how to define work. We know how to prioritize it. And we understand that delivering business value frequently is super important. As you can see in the definition here, things like making sure that we understand what value is super important. And that's why we have roles like product owners and product managers to make sure that we are articulating that value. And back to that triangle we saw a little earlier, that we are working on the highest value things, because remember, value is fixed, right? It's always going to be the thing that is ultimately at the top of our backlog. But remember that value is not always dollars. We sometimes make that mistake, depending on the industry in or the thing it is. It could be a representation of a bunch of things. Sometimes it will equate to risk. Sometimes it will equate to, perhaps some sort of customer impact. Understanding what your definition of value is super important. And then through using those small increments that we're used to in agility, that's how we then start to respond to this VUCA world, by going at speed. And that's why this move from project to, from project to product, thought I had that around the wrong way, from project to product is super important. Traditionally we've done things in project life cycles, but the problem is that projects start and stop and take a long time to spin up due to funding. Whereas the product life cycle is, let's make sure we have a value stream or a team that is constantly releasing things and is just always looking at what do we need from a business perspective. So again, I know a lot of your organizations are on that move to a product lifecycle. That is one of the reasons why we're doing that, in order to make sure that we can then working on the right things in our portfolio. The other thing about this is breaking things down, and you'll see a slide about that a little later on. But we have to stop building really big things. Doesn't mean we're not building big things in their entirety, but building them as one big bang rollout. In fact, I saw some research just yesterday. I was at a conference where some of the latest research is actually showing, rightly or wrongly, that the success factor of agile and waterfall is not that far away from each other. Agile's still more successful, but not by a lot, and the number is still quite low. What is interesting, though, is what the research is telling people is, regardless of the methodology you use, breaking things down to smaller chunks is the key. So if you were to break things down at the larger level to make sure that they're broken down at the smaller level, then you are going to see success from an agile way of working. But even if you're not all in, breaking things down at the larger level and then however you deliver it is still going to make it intimately more successful. So we spent a lot of time breaking things down, say at story card level or team level. Actually, the real key is how you do it at the larger level. So that's principle number 4. Principle number 5, I alluded to this before, structure and value streams. So this is the breaking of the silos and actually understanding what is all the steps that actually allow us to get something into the hands of a customer or to solve a problem. In actual fact, there's 2 types of value streams. I'll dig into this a little bit later. There's a better version of this diagram, but the one at the top is our operational value stream. That is the steps that somebody goes through in order to interact with our organization, right? A customer journey, if you will. And so understanding what that is and being able to build to that is important. But the second value stream we have, which is the little blue lines down the bottom, is what we call our development value streams, which is actually how we do the work. And in software, we often call that the SDLC, the software development lifecycle. That still exists. In an agile world, we just go through that rather quickly. But being able to map that out to make sure that we dot the I's and cross the T's, get to our definition of done, if you will, is super important. So this being able to then think about how we structure our organization, rather than being in our traditional silos and more into a value stream, can then help us meet the customer need. And thinking about both the organizational and the development value stream is important. Principle number 6, take accountability for outcomes over outputs. Again, a commonly used agile term. Outputs are important. They're the work. But outputs are not the thing that we really need to measure. That we just measure them to make sure we've done something. The outcome is what we're really trying to measure, is have we actually solved a problem. So outcomes need to be our primary focus. But actually, interestingly, outcomes are just one small step to ultimately an impact. Have we impact someone's life? Right? Have we made it better? Have we solved the problem that they were looking for? Are we making an impact in relation to sustainability, to helping our world? So we have measured outputs for so many years that we're very used to doing that and to thinking that success. Our push in the agile world has been towards outcomes. Actually, we need to keep pushing further into impact. But the whole point of lean portfolio management is, at its core, making sure that we're getting outcomes as opposed to just outputs, which can be a change for some of the traditional ways we've managed this. When you think about things like PMOs and the like, is how do we change those types of parts of our organization to not just be measuring have we done something in a status report, to actually what outcome have we got to. And again, that's hard, because figuring out how to measure it has always been a hard part. that's where lean portfolio management helps us, is understanding what that measurement will look like. And if we understand the package of work that's built that up, we can then have a better way of being able to manage it. Principle number 7, optimize flow and reduce waste across the whole system. I talked about value a little earlier. Waste is just the opposite of value, right? Those things are linked. If you remove the waste, you ultimately then have a valuable part of the process. So you want to identify those values, the things that add value, identify the things that have waste and remove them. So amplify the value, reduce the waste, but all the way through making sure that you're not losing sight of the customer, because sometimes when we remove waste, we actually do lose sight of the customer. Sometimes things that we think are waste maybe aren't necessarily waste. But waste in itself is still, a big part of all of our processes, and part of what agile and lean were really meant to eliminate at its heart. But some of you may have seen the PMI data on this, the Project Management Institute. For those of you dialing in from Australia, particularly, Australia is the worst in the world according to their research in relation to project waste. And the numbers say that in Australia we waste about $130 million per $1 billion whenever we build something or release a project. Now, by the way, Kiwis don't get too excited about that. You weren't that far behind us. You were still in the 100 millions. And most of the organizations were split by, I think the best was China. I think it may be at 75 million per billion. The interesting thing, though, is whenever I show people those stats or talk to them about them, if I say to you that, we waste 130 million per billion, so that's 13%, everybody goes, is that all? Like, everybody seems to, think that actually seems rather low, and that's even more scary. So when you talk about in those terms, they sound like large numbers, but when you think about it in percentages, I think if we all looked at our processes, 13% would actually be a pretty good number if we could even get to that. So I think the numbers are probably, potentially worse than what the studies were showing. I see a question from Sabby. Is there data around how much agile organizations waste? That's a good question. The data I've seen was just generic, but I suspect that whilst I suspect the number would be higher, but I still suspect the waste would be quite high, because when you really look at a lot of organizations who are implementing agility, whilst we talk about waste, it is not our focus. So I don't know what the data is. If someone does know a place to get that data, I'd be interested. But I suspect that the number is still rather high, even though it would probably be better than a perhaps a more traditional organization. But traditional organizations had things like Lean Six Sigma that were focused on that as well, and we weren't really able to lick it. The difference from the days where Lean Six Sigma was as popular as it was is that we have so much more data to tell us that than we had back then. I know when I went through Lean Six Sigma, Black Belt, and all those things, it was all about, the biggest issue was how did you get the data? So data is not our problem anymore. It's again, it's the focus on it. Thank you, Sabi, sorry. Principle number 8, shorten planning and funding cycles. So this again is thinking about our end-to-end cycles, but how do we be more iterative in our cycles? And so if anyone here is doing SAFe and PI planning or some sort of horizon planning, this is what it's getting at, but then actually making that really valuable. So how do we put things into value streams? Again, if you're doing something like SAFe, that's what an agile release train or an art is supposed to be about. Fund those value streams appropriately, make sure that they have the right decision making, make sure that they get feedback, make sure that they're then delivering value. So if you're on your journey to or doing that already, you're probably on your way. The question is it all these things in the right hand side? Are your cycles outcome focused? Are they organized around true value streams, not just say technology streams or business streams? Are they responsive and transparent? Is it a bottom-up participatory process? In other words, everybody's working together to make sure we are working on the right thing, and are we able to pivot or change tact rather quickly? That's when you start to get successful at this. And then principle number 9 is balance capacity and demand, which has always been the problem. We need to continue to feed the engine, but are we making sure that we have the right people working on it, that we have enough people? The biggest issue I see in most organizations is managing the WIP, right, the work in progress. And typically, most organizations I work with, they've got too much WIP and they're reluctant to stop that, which is again understandable because they've got great ideas and they need to get them out. But also, as we've all seen, if you've ever played anything like the penny flipping game in agile class or any of those type of things, is that if you slow down that whip, you will actually get through more things. It's just that we don't like stopping things in organization, or we haven't put the right focus on there or given them the right attention. So this is where things like a pool-based Kanban system will work, taking an economic view. We'll talk about a few of those things in just a minute. I think the analogy to think about this is that there's only so much capacity you have. So it's like the old analogy of a printer, right? You can shove as much paper as you like into a printer, but it can only print so many pages per minute or per hour. Doesn't matter how much you try to shove in there. It can only go as fast as the slowest point, right? So managing the bottlenecks. So to wrap this up, right? When we think about the difference between lean portfolio and traditional, and again, you can see these slides, but if you just look to the right-hand side here, is that we have more people across the organization, contributing to decision-making, even if that's just being aware of it. Structuring people more around those value streams, or at least into some sort of stability, rather than flipping them in and out of projects. Making our plans value-based rather than, what we think is the most important thing. So some sort of science or logic behind that. Making sure that we are doing rapid feedback loops, which is that funnel I showed you before, going up and down, thinking about how we fund those value streams, and then measuring them in a more outcome-based way. So I'd like to pause at this point, and I'm going to ask you to join with me in a very quick chat blast. This is where we use the chat window, which is the easiest tool we have available to us. And I want to ask this very simple question, is which principle of those 9, and you can see them on the right-hand side here just summarized, in your organization now, which do you think would be the simplest to implement? What would be the simplest to implement? And you can just write the number, if you like, into the chat, just to make it easy. We'll collate the star at the end to see if there's any trend across the folks that are here, but what would be the simplest? Thank you, Sarah, for kicking us off. She's gone with principle number 2. 5, another 2. A 3, another 2. A 9, a 6, a 3, an 8, a 9, an 8, 2, more 8s, another 2. All right, keep playing, folks. What starts to become interesting when I've done this exercise or anything like it is when you start to see the numbers as you start to bring them in, is that you actually start to see that different organizations actually have spent time doing different things here. And whilst things like communicating strategy with transparency often comes out a little more popular, because in reality, it's something particularly in the last few years organizations to focus on, is that what you start to see even in these numbers is that actually different organizations have different strengths in different places. And that's what makes this rather interesting. If we think about even like a webinar like this, is that for the people we have on this webinar, there's people already in our community and organizations who have licked different parts of this. And that's the beauty of the Agile community, is we can start to share those lessons. So if you're also struggling with something, maybe somebody who's given a different answer might be a good person just to have a talk to. Reach out and go, well, how have you done that? How are you doing that? Why is that thing that's very simple? And I won't ask you now, but I could ask the question, which one's the most difficult to implement? In our longer course, we actually step into that and go, not only how would we rank these, but then how hard are they, or how would we actually go about doing them? Thank you, folks. All right. So if they are then our principles, let's just have a look at some of the practices that helps us in delivering lean portfolio. Now, this is going to be a very quick 40,000-foot view. If you sit one of the classes around this or read the books on lean portfolio management, we'd go in a lot more detail. So the point of this is just to point out what some of these things are for you to think about, and then perhaps drill down to if any of these appeal to you. So what are some of the key principles? Well, the first one is making sure that we understand what our strategic themes are. And those strategic themes are made up of a bunch of stuff. They can be our vision, they can be what is on our backlog or in our portfolio Kanban, there'll be the vision further down at our across all of our levels, whether that be strategic, program level, or team level. Our budgets will play into that. Obviously, if we have more money to put towards something, we might be a little more bold in our strategic themes, as well as what we call our guardrails, which I'll mention in more details in just a second. And the key to that is we need to make sure that we then connect our portfolio with those strategic themes. So when we think about portfolio of work, for example, you can see the one on the left here is that, the strategic theme for this retail e-commerce site is that our job is to appeal to a younger demographic but also reduce our warehousing costs. Well, the thing is, when you start to then break down your work, you understand what's important. If it doesn't feel like it's something that's going to hit a younger demographic, that's going to get someone more like me, then perhaps we're looking in the wrong direction. Or asking the question, everything we do, will this help us slightly reduce the amount we're spending on warehouse? And you can see the difference to the not so great examples. Firstly, increasing shareholder wealth and maximizing corporate value, whilst they may be the ultimate aims of our organization overall, if you take care of the stuff in the green, that will ultimately take care of the stuff that's in the orange. So by being a lot more clear about what those themes are is super important. And sometimes we're good at doing this at a product level, but what this allows us to do is make sure that our stream of work and the things that are coming through our portfolio are actually hitting the right area. I mentioned this one earlier, the difference between or making sure you visualize the operation and development value streams and realizing that there is two different value streams. So how do we organize our people? And so, this is really about breaking down those silos and saying, using the example at the top, if we're talking about building a loan in order to help a customer, if we're a bank, then putting together the people that allow that loan to go from end to end is a much better way of organizing the work than it going through a bunch of silos. This does create challenges for anyone who's done that, particularly when you start to get bottlenecks of skills. So this often looks very easy on paper, is a lot harder to implement, but you have to push through that issue, because the problems that our silos create are a lot greater than the problems of getting through the how those value streams might look. But I'll tell you that in most times I've seen this, you have to usually have a couple of goes, be iterative, interesting concept, but be iterative in how you actually start to design those. But also, as you start to design them, also realize about what is the best way for us to do the work. So you have to think about that development value stream at the same time. I mentioned guardrails before. This is just the dig down is thinking about when you're funding your lean portfolio, where do you want to spend your money? So it can be very enticing to spend it on the new shiny stuff, or equally could be enticing to spend it on just keeping the lights on. But where is that funding so that you can continue to have a pipeline of things coming through, right? If you're spending all your money on the products you have now, you're going to miss the next market. So this does take some time to sit down and think about where do we want to put it. In fact, you can see at the bottom here, when you start to talk about development value streams, those may be different depending on where you're pushing the funding. But the idea is to keep an eye on where those things are, so that you're alerted when perhaps you're not utilizing your funding or spending your money in the right spaces. As I said, otherwise, if you're spending everything really close to where you are now, which is horizon 0 and 1, you have to spend a little bit what's coming down so that you can feed the pipe a little later. And that comes into then how you do a mix in your portfolio. And typically there's 3 parts to that. These 2 diagrams on both sides are the same, they're just different words. You've got to keep your core, what's the sort of adjacent transformational, or in more layman's terms, what do you need to run the business? What do you need to build new business or build out new things? And then what is the down the track sort of R&D? And depending on the type of work that you're doing, will depending on the mix that's involved there. So understanding that mix is important. And then that is essentially what we call budgeting guardrails. So making sure that we are mixing those long-term and short-term, making sure we're balancing those efforts, as we said before, making sure then what the approval process is, particularly for large things, which will suck up a lot of that portfolio, and then how do we make sure that everybody understands what those decisions have been. And so the way of doing that in the agile world is a more participatory budgeting type process, which is making sure that you're taking in all of those inputs, and constantly reviewing them, because as we saw before, right, the world's not the same. So you can't do that and just lock it in for the next 5 years. You're going to have to constantly look what's going on and make some tough decisions around what those actually look like. So the idea is to do these fairly regularly. What that then means is, once you've made those decisions, is how do you communicate that? And by doing that is by using what we call an outcome-oriented roadmap. Now, I have another webinar where I've talked about roadmaps in more detail. So, that's a whole webinar topic in its own right. But the point here is that these aren't your grandfather's roadmaps. An outcome-oriented roadmap is very much around what we talked about before, is not what we typically put on there, which is the work or the outcome, but actually what is the output that we're looking for. And what this allows us to see is make sure we understand where the dependencies and the constraints are, make sure that we're not working on too many things at once, but also we have that measurable outcome, as you can see by the taco example on the page. And how that breaks down is it allows you to get from strategic to tactical. Because when you think about the roadmap, what we're really looking for is down here is the next few quarters that we're working on. And you'll notice, by the way, the colors on this roadmap get progressively lighter. It's because it gets more vague the further we get down. But that's our strategy into the next, however long you want to go. This one's just showing us throughout 3 to 4 quarters. But what then that allows us to do is, when we roll the next quarter, that then becomes our planning. So we break those quarters into months. If I go back to this one here, you'll see there's July, August, September, and then there's the next few quarters. These then becomes the current quarter, and that's what you feed into your horizon planning. So we're still not breaking things down at this point into iteration by iteration, sprint by sprint, or into something you might put in your Kanban backlog, but it allows us to break these things down to make sure that they're sizable, which then will allow the team at some point to move that into their tactical plan, which is the backlog. And the thing about the roadmap is that it then helps you communicate to your stakeholders about exactly what we're thinking moving forward. This is a living document that will constantly change. It allows us to talk to our customers, right? We might amend that for public consumption, but we can talk to them. And of course, our product backlog is what ultimately is the product and feature that will actually end up in there. And if you're using a continuous deployment type model, we're not necessarily waiting to the end of the quarter to get them there. They're getting the most valuable thing all the time. So the idea of the roadmap is it allows you to do that prioritization technique without having to manage, hundreds of things in a backlog. You feed the backlog from your roadmap. And so this is another way of looking at this breakdown, is how do we take the things into our portfolio funnel and start to break them down? So if you see here initiative 1 through to 4, imagine that was traditionally a large piece of work, say a 12-month project. How do we actually take that and break it down into something that gives us an outcome at the most every quarter? And when we start to do that, it means we can make decisions, because if something like initiative 5 comes along, we can then stop and go, hey, we don't have the time to do both 2 and 5. We made to make a decision to pause 2 because we've delivered some value already in 1, work on 5, and then re-pick up 2, 3, and 4 at a later date. Simplified example, but you can make better decisions when you've broken things down. And so the way we do that in a lean portfolio perspective is by using something like portfolio Kanban, which actually at its heart is exactly the same as a team-based Kanban or a personal Kanban. It's just at a higher level. We're pulling things through. In this case, and this is just an example, we have a backlog that we then validate by some sort of value metric, right? Should we do it? Can we do it? Right, that then becomes that prioritized backlog that that perhaps more people can see. When it starts executing, we pull the work through. Because this is broken down into bite-sized chunks, we're only pulling through something when we've got capacity to do it, so we can see exactly how far the work is going until we finally get it to done. Of course, you have to think about governance. There's a lot of words on this slide. Won't go through these today. Again, you can read these in your own time. But governance is making sure, are we all aligned, right? Are we measuring the right things? Do we understand what our expectations are? Are we transparent so that the people that need the information have the information? Are we focusing on making sure that we're doing the right thing and that people understand what the work is? And are we being agile about it? So the whole area of governance, again, a whole topic in its own right, plays into how you have a successful portfolio. Which means that your transparency, so using things like obeyers, whether they be physical like in this diagram or virtual by using tooling, is super important. And how that all maps out, folks, is you have to put some more structure around this. Now, this is just a serving suggestion. I've taken this one from SAFE, but it means on a monthly basis, you need to make sure that the portfolio is syncing up so that we get that feedback we were talking about before, which can then roll up to a more strategic portfolio review. Maybe halfway through the quarter, which is something that happens at lean portfolio level, and then you can see the participatory budgeting that happens a little less regularly on the way through. So here's another chat blast question I want to ask very quickly. What would you like to learn more about? If we were to do a follow-up webinar, what one of these subjects, and they're the main subjects I just mentioned, which ones have piqued your curiosity? Give us an answer in the chat. And again, we will take your answers and see if they put them into a chart. We'll provide you the answers when we send out the slides or publish the slides after the talk. Okay, so last little section, just some things to think about is the how and who. So who does this? I've taken this from the Scaled Agile framework. I kind of like the diagram around this. Particularly the three parts of the triangle that says that when we think about lean portfolio, we have to think about the strategic and investment side of it. So that's where the executive and your more senior people are thinking. We have to think about how we do it from a governance perspective. So you can see on there it talks about a VMO. It used to be called a PMO. The only difference is the V stands for value. So instead of a project management office or portfolio management office, it's now a value management office. In other words, it's how do we make sure that we're focusing on the value? So we need some governance around that, and that's typically where LPM lives. But then we also have the people that support this, and that may be your Lean and Agile Center of Excellence, your coaches, as well as your VMO in supporting it, because you have to continue to give it the love. This is a little roadmap. This is something that takes time to put in. And so, you have to start by getting alignment that everybody, understands what this means. And then you have to do some organization, strategize, then finally make it operational before you then start to govern it and then start to make improvements on it. It's no different to any adoption roadmap. The scary thing is that the folks at SAFE came up with a model for this, and it looks like this, which doesn't even fit on the slide. I don't even understand it, to be honest with you. So let me dumb it down for you. Here's my view of it, is where do you really start? You have to design it, right? Quite simply, right? In designing it, you're going to have to engage. Engage your coaches, engage your change people, strategic people, as well as your traditional PMO or VMO. And then from there, you're going to have to think about financials. If you're going to start talking about guardrails, how does that start to play in? When you start to break down work, it makes the funding cycle a little different. You have to have the change agents that are going to help you get this through, which means you have to involve leadership, and you're going to have to stay on a continual communication and education process. So you have to work down that. But like the diagram before, it's a set of stages that you go through. And organizations I've worked with on this before, you don't just do this in one afternoon. Like any change, you have to sort of sneak up on it, but you have to be also clear what it is that you're trying to get out. So who are your participants? Think about who makes the investment decisions, who influences them, who actually supports the portfolio now, and will they continue to do it in the future? You might want to think about how you might start to streamline that. I worked in an organization just recently where they had 8 different PMOs, and that was only within one division of the organization. It's really scary. Who's going to implement this? So who's actually driving it? Who's going to facilitate as we start to do this? Again, you might already be doing some of that in relation to your big room planning. And then don't forget the people who are executing it, because they will be impacted by this, even though the idea is it does make their life easier. So to sum up, what does it mean for your organization? In the words of Mary Poppendieck, right, in lean thinking, the question is not whether people are busy or not, it's whether they're busy doing the right thing. And the question is, are you working on the right things? Are you working on too many things? So the whole idea of this is so we do actually get an accurate representation of what we're working on, particularly, for a lot of our organizations right now where, we do have to think about, make some tough decisions, I guess, about where our organization is going. And so I come back to this slide is how do we now move the needle fully into that yellow cog? Many of us are sort of playing around the outside of that. How do we push into there? The principles of lean portfolio management will help you with that. So I do suggest going and taking a look at the notes that are on this slide deck. Go take a look at the paper from IC Agile. And remember, the intent is that this is about true business agility, is that everything we've seen over the last 45 minutes or so is about making sure that we are customer centric, that we are thinking about the culture of our organization, which empowers more people to do their best work, that we are continuing to do value-based delivery as we have always done in an agile space, that our operations can be a little more flexible. So it starts to have some of the tough conversations we need to have in our organizations, and that we are putting our leadership in a people-first space, and again, allowing our people to do their best work. The little shameless plug, if you want to get into deeper here at SoftEd, we have a couple of options for you. Our IC Agile Lean Portfolio Management class, it's a 2-day immersive into some of the content you saw has come from that. But really, how do you do it is the deepest part. If you are in a scaled agile environment, the Lean Portfolio Management class from SAFE is actually very good. I've taught that a few times. If you're interested in the SAFE version, we can also help you with that as well if that's your area. The interesting thing about Lean Portfolio Management is that particularly SAFE and IC Agile have sort of been leading the conversation around that term. What's interesting between both of them is they're actually fairly similar. The only difference with the SAFE Lean Portfolio Management is it is geared more towards the SAFE language, but the concepts are relatively similar, which is great. And I'll hand it back to you, Colin, if we've got any questions from anybody. So thank you, everybody, for taking a little bit of time out of your afternoon, and hopefully that's answered some of your questions about Lean Portfolio Management.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. So if you have any questions, we've got the chat window and the question Q&A window there. Feel free to add them in. And while we wait, I've just got one myself that I was a little curious about. You were talking about at the start, going beyond the yellow. You're talking about getting to the yellow, but moving beyond the yellow into the orange or whatever it is. You talk about one of the things there was the customer seat at the table. Mm-hmm. And that, that's kind of important. It makes sense. We also mentioned about from the Business Agility Business Institute, the responsive customer centricity. And you've mentioned the phrase that everyone needs a clear line of sight to the customer. How close are we as an industry to getting even towards that orange level, to getting that customer view?
Oh, yeah. That's a bit of a hard question to answer, Colin, because different organizations do it in different ways. And even inside a same organization, sometimes one part of the organization has this done very well, while some others may struggle with it a little more. So I think data on that is hard to answer. I think the overall thing is that we still know that we still need to get better at that. And so one of the things I'll say is when you look at this diagram, we're all doing parts along the entire cog of this system. There's some people on this call now, some very good coaches that join us today, and thank you for joining us. I know they're all chipping away at the things on this list here. The thing is that we're not complete, and so the point to this is that organizations aren't even complete in the team agility thing necessarily, but what we're seeing is the data is telling us that we're getting better at, we're pretty good at that, right? There's enough information and data and people out there that can help you do it well, and the same is starting to be true for scaling. We're somewhere through that green cog, almost all the way through. Where we still see the data is that we haven't quite licked all of the things in the yellow, orange, and red cogs at this point. That's the challenge for us.
So the practices are not so much out there and unknown. We know the practices, right? It's just a matter of getting them embedded in the organization. Is that correct?
It's how do we now start to do these things well? So through this whole presentation, to be honest with you, there's nothing new in here. As I said right at the start, it's how do we take the things we've learned at a team level and have done pretty well for a long time. Again, your mileage will vary, but well known. but we haven't been terribly good at elevating them to the next level because we start to hit a whole bunch of other brick walls like finance, legal, procurement, HR, all of those types of areas, because we haven't been doing true business agility. We've been doing, technology agility or team agility. And whilst that's given us a lot of, made us better at delivering value, we don't see the true value from agility until we start to bring it across the entire organization.
And then we need to start seriously looking at that outcome and impact, isn't it?
Correct.
Right. Okay. Well, we don't appear to have any questions, and our hour is just about up. So I think we will wrap it up at that. Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you very much for joining us.
All right. If everyone's got any questions, feel free to reach out on email. We'll be happy to hit you there if you want to ask them offline.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.